Right, let's see it.
Let's start with John 8. In this passage, Jesus is in the temple in Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles, and he gets into an intense debate with the Jewish religious leaders. And then jumping to verse 56, Jesus says this: "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, 'You are not yet 50 years old and you've seen Abraham?' Jesus said to them, 'Truly, truly, before Abraham was, I am.'"
Hold on, before we get to verse 58, let's take a look at the context. Let's take a look at the other things that these Jewish folks saw and heard Jesus say, at least according to the narrative that was composed by the authors of the Gospel of John. Let's go back to verse 26. "I have much to say about you and much to condemn, but the one who sent me is true, and I declare to the world what I have heard from him." So Jesus right here is quite explicitly framing himself as an agent sent by God. So this is not God, at least not the Father, according explicitly to the text, but this is an agent who is sent by the Father. And then in verse 28, so Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will realize that I am He." And in Greek, this is ego eimi. This is the exact same encoded reference to a variant form of the divine name. So Jesus is already appealing to that encoded reference to a variant form of the divine name. "And that I do nothing on my own, but I speak these things as the Father instructed me." Now, nobody ever appeals to verse 28 as the declaration that Jesus is God, and there's a good reason for that, because immediately after saying ego eimi, Jesus says, "And I do what I'm told," which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That would not have resonated with Jewish people of that time. I am God, and as God, I do what I'm told. That doesn't make any sense. No one would interpret ego eimi, I am He, as a declaration of being the very God of Israel. However, if they did pick up this encoded reference to a variant form of the divine name in the context of saying, I am an agent of God, empowered by God and sent by God, they would pick up on something else, namely that the Hebrew Bible already has an agent of God who is empowered by God by the divine name. That's the messenger of Adonai, or the angel of the Lord, because in Exodus 23, verses 20 through 22, we have God say, I'm sending a messenger before you to guide you on the way. Don't disobey him, don't annoy him, because he doesn't have to forgive your sins, because my name is in him. And so the divine name as a vehicle for divine power and authority is already asserted in the Hebrew Bible and is being elaborated on in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature. We have the Son of Man in the Enochic literature, who is related to the divine name, who does things that only God is supposed to be able to do, who is worshipped by everyone on earth in the parables of Enoch, which were probably composed in the century before the composition of the New Testament. And then we have an interesting thing. We have the Apocalypse of Abraham, where we have another angel, Yahoel, which combines the divine names Adonai and the title El, God. And Yahoel is sent by God and empowered by the divine name to go do things that only God is supposed to do for Abraham. And we're going to get to something more interesting about the story of the Apocalypse of Abraham in just a moment. But keep in mind, the Apocalypse of Abraham was probably written right before the Gospel of John. So, what do you have to say about verse 58?
This is a stunning statement, overflowing with divinity that those Jewish leaders speaking with Jesus in the court of the temple would not have missed. Not only does he claim to have existed before Abraham, which would make him a lunatic if he were merely human.
So there's a bit of a rhetorical sleight of hand going on here, but I don't think it's intentional. I think it is an artifact of just uncritically adopting and repeating the claims that this content creator has heard from other apologists. In the ancient world, the relationship of divinity and humanity was not a simple binary. It was not just the very God of Israel and then mere humans. It was a continuum, and you had all kinds of entities that existed in the middle of that continuum or that spectrum between deity and humanity. You had exalted humans. You had angelic and other figures who mediated between the very God of Israel and mere humans. You had humans who were referred to as Elohim in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it was a spectrum or a continuum, not a binary. And when you reduce it to a binary, you use that dichotomy as a methodological shoehorn for saying, well, Jesus was more than human, therefore God of Israel. When the reality is, Jesus is more than human, but also not yet the God of Israel. Jesus operates on the middle of that spectrum, somewhere between mere human and God of Israel. And a wonderful book on this topic is Michael Peppard's book, The Son of God in the Roman World, that talks precisely about the fact that in this time and place, the relationship between deity and humanity was more of a spectrum than a dichotomy.
But he also claims the sacred name of God for himself. I am. In Hebrew, it's Ehyeh. In Greek, it's ego, eimi. This is the divine name that God used for himself back in Exodus 3:14 when he told Moses, I am who I am. Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh.
Yes, but a couple things to note here. In addition to what I have already pointed out about a tradition having developed in the Hebrew Bible about a divine agent who bears the divine name and therefore can not only do what God does, but even in some circumstances identify as God, as the angel does in Exodus 3:6, where the angel of Adonai who appeared to Moses in the flame of fire in the burning bush says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So bearing the divine name endows the divine agent with divine authority. That is a tradition that is widespread, not just in Greco-Roman period Judaism, but even in later rabbinic Judaism. We have centuries after Jesus traditions about Metatron, bearing the divine name and being identified as Adonai. So there's a story about a certain heretic who comes to Ravi Idit and says, hey, there's this part where God says, come up to Adonai. Why doesn't that say, come up to me? And the rabbi says, oh, because that's not Adonai. That's Metatron, who has a similar name to Adonai. And then the heretic says, oh, so we should worship Metatron. And that's where Ravi Idit wags the finger and says, no, no, no. So we already have a long-standing tradition of this divine agent who bears God's name, speaks on behalf of God, can do what only God is supposed to be able to do, and can, in certain circumstances, even identify as God. That's going to be the main literary understanding of these cues. And one of the reasons we know this is literary is that ego eimi is the Greek version of this self-identification. It doesn't really work in Aramaic or in Hebrew, but in Greek, ego eimi is not only used for Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the rendering is ego eimi hoon in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Exodus 3, but it's also the Greek rendering of ani hu, I am he, which is used in Deuteronomy and in Deutero-Isaiah as another divine self-identification, where God says, you will know that Ani hu, I am he. And this is what Jesus says in John 8:28, where he says, after identifying as the Son of Man, you will know that ego eimi, I am he, another bit of self-identification that is winking at the fact that the Son of Man bears the divine name. And then again, Jesus goes on to say, and I do what I'm told, which would not have made anyone think, oh, he's claiming to be the very God of Israel. It precisely would have made them think, oh, he's claiming to be the agent who bears the divine name and so can do what only God is supposed to be able to do. That is the context, literarily, historically, rhetorically, for what's going on here with the appeal to the coded reference to a variant form of the divine name.
And here's Jesus standing in the temple in Jerusalem, claiming that name for himself. And the Jewish leaders knew exactly what he meant. Verse 59. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. They wanted to stone Jesus to death for claiming to be God. So yes, Jesus did declare in no uncertain terms that he is God.
Absolutely not. In addition to the fact that we have already seen Jesus appeal to the ego eimi encoded reference to a variant form of the divine name, he did so immediately before saying, "And I do what I'm told," which would not make anybody think he's claiming to be God, but fits much more comfortably with the idea that he's claiming to be a divine agent endowed with the divine name and therefore the power and authority and agency and even presence of God. And that is also a perfectly good reason for someone to represent Jewish people trying to stone him for blasphemy. Blasphemy was not just claiming to be God. Very few people did that. Blasphemy was any kind of speech or action that was interpreted as denigrating God and claiming to be this authorized bearer of the divine name, claiming to be God's agent, certainly qualified as blasphemy in the eyes of someone who is antagonistic towards Jesus. So the argument that this is Jesus claiming to be God because they tried to stone him requires that blasphemy specifically and pretty much only refer to claiming to be the very God of Israel. And it manifestly did not only refer to that, as I've discussed in other videos. But I also want to point to something else interesting. Jesus says, "Abraham saw my day and rejoiced." There's no biblical precedent for that. What on earth is Jesus referring to? Well, the answer might be in the Apocalypse of Abraham. There's a wonderful scholar named Andrew Perriman who recently published a wonderful book called In the Form of a God, which is the preexistence of the exalted Christ in Paul. And on his blog, Post Ost, he has an article called Before Abraham Was, I Am, and Before John Was the Apocalypse of Abraham. Again, this was probably written just a decade or two before the Gospel of John was composed. But in chapter 10 of the Apocalypse of Abraham, this is where we have God endowing the angel Yahoel with the divine name and telling the angel to, by mediation of that divine name, go and do the things God wants him to do for Abraham. But in the same chapter, that angel tells Abraham, "Stand up and rejoice," and then gives him a vision of the coming judgment and talks about how God is going to send the chosen one who is going to judge the world. This is what Abraham is supposed to rejoice about. This is, I think, the most plausible antecedent or precedent for this statement that Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. There's certainly nothing nearly as clear in the Bible, but it would also fit with what I've suggested is the most likely literary and conceptual context for Jesus' appeal to the divine name, that Jesus is the chosen one, the one sent by God, that Abraham was shown in vision by the angel Yahoel, and that all of this is vibing with this idea of a divine agent who bears the divine name doing what only God is supposed to be able to do. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, Yahoel is that divine agent, but the author of the Gospel of John is representing Jesus as that agent who has been given the divine name and who speaks on behalf of God, who bears God's power and agency and authority and even presence, and is bringing about that final judgment against the Jewish folks that the authors of the Gospel of John are representing as the offspring of Satan rather than of Abraham. That's a far better, far more plausible explanation of what's going on rhetorically and literarily in John chapter 8. It's not Jesus claiming to be God. It's Jesus claiming to have been given the divine name and to be the divine agent of God who does what he's told, but who also can act in the name of and on behalf of God. That's what's going on in John 8.